The cabin, the Karen, and the unexpected guest. Crisp mountain air whistled through the towering pine trees. As I stood on the porch of my recently renovated cabin, watching the sun dip behind the ridgeline, this place perched quietly in the foothills just outside city limits had been my escape, my sanctuary from the chaos of urban life and, most importantly, from the ever-watchful eyes of our homeowners association. I had spent years dealing with the HOA in my suburban neighborhood. Petty fines for unapproved flower pots, anonymous complaints about the color of my shed, and constant surveillance from a board president who seemed to think she was the sheriff of a gated empire. Her name, Margaret Winthrop, or, as we all called her, Karen Supreme. After finally getting fed up with the nonsense, I sold my house and bought this piece of land nestled near a private lake. It wasn't in the HOA's jurisdiction, or so I thought. I was wrong. Very, very wrong. The cabin of Freedom Cabin had belonged to my grandfather, who left it to me in his will with one simple instruction: use this place to live the life they never let you live. At the time, I thought he meant city life and its never-ending grind. But now, those words seemed eerily prescient. For the past 6 months, I had slowly transformed the place into something beautiful. Solar panels for off-grid power, a deck facing the lake, a stone fire pit I built with my own hands, and even a small guest room where friends or family could stay the night. That it was a place of peace. Until the HOA reared its ugly head again. Despite having absolutely no claim to this land, the letter that started it lit came on a Monday. A plain manila envelope slid under my door while I was out picking up some lumber. No stamp, no address, just a typed letter to the occupant of 1425 Pine Ridge Trail. You are in violation of Article 8, Section 4, regarding unauthorized structures and non-compliant residence usage. Failure to respond within 10 days will result in escalated enforcement actions. HOA Compliance and Enforcement Divisione scoffed at it. The letter looked official, sure, but it was nonsense. Pine Ridge Trail wasn't even part of the HOA district. There had never been a discussion, a vote, or any form of annexation. So I did what any rational person would do. I ignored it. That turned out to be a mistake. Karen Supreme. 3 days later, I heard the gravel crunch under heavy tires. I looked out from the kitchen window and immediately saw the unmistakable sight of a white Suburban crawling up my long private driveway. And then I saw her, Margaret Winthrop, sunglasses, clipboard, scowl, the full Karen uniform. She didn't come alone. Behind her were 2 HOA board members, her lackeys from the neighborhood, each looking like they were ready to storm a compound instead of visit a lakeside cabin. I stepped out to meet them. "Afternoon," I said, trying to keep things cordial. "Something I can help you with?" Karen looked me up and down like I had tracked mud onto her marble floors. "You've been served notice. You have 10 days to cease and desist your unlawful occupancy and demolish the unauthorized structure." I blinked. Double quotes, "Lady, I own this property. It's not in your HOA. You've got no authority here." She tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured finger. "This parcel has been recently acquired under an extended jurisdiction vote, passed by the association last quarter. It is now subject to enforcement under the bylaws of Cedar Pine Estates." I laughed, not just a chuckle, a full belly laugh. "You extended your HOA jurisdiction to a private parcel 6 miles outside your development." She didn't flinch. "Yes, and who approved that?" "The board, including you, of course." "That's not how the law works." Her eyes narrowed. "You'll want to be careful, Mr. Brooks. We can fine you. We can file injunctions. And if needed, we can enforce compliance through authorized entry." She turned to walk away and added one final threat over her shoulder. "We'll be back." The surveillance and the setup that week, I started noticing strange things. A black SUV parked down the road at odd hours, a drone hovering briefly over my cabin before zipping off, and then I caught one of her goons, Tom Weller, snooping around near my fence line, pretending to be birdwatching with a zoom lens aimed directly at my solar panels. I installed cameras, changed locks, and even called the sheriff's department. They confirmed what I already knew: Karen and her cronies had zero legal claim to my property. But she didn't care about legality. She cared about control. And when she realized the law wouldn't side with her, she decided to take matters into her own hands. The day it all exploded was a Saturday morning, around 10 a.m., and I was inside the cabin with my guest and old friend named Alex. We had gone to college together, and though we had lost touch for years, fate had reconnected us recently when Alex reached out after seeing one of my posts about the cabin. What I didn't know at the time was that Alex wasn't just a friend. He was also a federal attorney working on land and property rights cases. But we'll get to that in a moment. That morning, we were sipping coffee and talking about old times when the door suddenly shook. Boom, boom, boom. I jumped up. Alex set his cup down calmly but with narrowed eyes. Who the hell? I muttered, reaching for the front door. Before I could get there, the door burst open, splintering on its hinges. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Karen, wearing a reflective vest like she was on a search and rescue team, flanked by 3 of her lackeys, including Tom. They all stormed in like they were executing a raid. You are under citizen's arrest for failure to comply with HOA ordinances. Karen barked. Are you out of your mind? I shouted. You just broke into my house. It's not a house, it's an illegal structure. Then she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Yes, this is Margaret Winthrop, president of the HOA. I have detained a non-compliant trespasser. Please send units immediately. I couldn't believe it. She was staging a fake arrest on private land. But before I could say anything more, Alex stepped forward, calmly pulling out a leather ID badge. The room froze. Ma'am, he said in a commanding voice. I'm Alexander Grant. I work with the U.S. Attorney's Office on Federal Land Rights and Property Encroachment Enforcement. You have just committed unlawful entry, destruction of private property, and attempted impersonation of law enforcement. Karen blinked. You're lying. Alex held out the badge. Closer. I'm not, and I suggest you sit down before this gets worse for you. Karen looked at her crew. Tom looked like he was about to pass out. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Someone else must have called for help after hearing the door break in. Karen's fake bravado began to melt. And it was just the beginning. The sirens, the sheriff, and the signature that changed everything as the shrill wails of sirens drew closer. A strange silence fell over the broken threshold of my cabin. The wooden door lay hanging from its last hinge, crushed inward like it had been tackled by a SWAT team instead of a self-righteous HOA president. Dust swirled in the late morning sunlight, illuminated in shafts that pierced through the shattered entryway. As Karen stood frozen in the center of the living room like a deer caught in headlights, except this deer wore for $100 loafers and an HOA vest emblazoned with the words compliance and enforcement. Her clipboard trembled in her grip, and for once, her smug certainty had vanished. Behind her, her 2 cronies Tom Weller and Janice Simmons fidgeted nervously, eyes darting to the approaching sound of law enforcement, mouths slightly agape. As they began to realize what they had just involved themselves in, Alex remained calm, his ID still in his hand. Unlike the rest of us, he moved slowly, deliberately, with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms and had seen egos crumble under the weight of law. Everyone needs to remain exactly where they are, he said in a tone that left no room for argument. Especially you, Mrs. Winthrop. Any movement from this point forward can and will be used against you. The way he said it, firm but not theatrical, sent a visible shiver down Karen's spine. The so-called queen of the HOA had finally met someone with more authority, and she didn't know how to react. Moments later, a sheriff's SUV and 2 patrol cars tore around the bend in the gravel road and skidded to a stop just outside the cabin. Gravel sprayed into the underbrush as deputies poured out with weapons holstered, but hands hovering near them. The first to reach the porch was Sheriff Dale Nichols, a tall, broad-shouldered man with 30 years of mountain law enforcement under his belt and a deep-rooted sense of fairness that had earned him respect from both locals and newcomers alike. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, the busted door, the visibly shaken guests, the group of trespassers still standing in the middle of a private home, and Alex, holding his ID like a poker card. What the hell's going on here? The sheriff barked, his voice echoing through the forest like a thunderclap. Before I could speak, Karen stepped forward, pointing her clipboard like it was a sword. "Officer, I am Margaret Winthrop, president of the Cedar Pine Estates HOA. This individual," she gestured at me, "is unlawfully occupying an unpermitted structure that falls under our jurisdiction. I executed a legal citizen's arrest and contacted emergency services in accordance with HOA Article 8, Section 6. Sheriff Nichols raised an eyebrow. "You broke down a man's door and entered his home without a warrant, based on HOA rules?" Karen didn't flinch. "We have legal authority." "No, ma'am." The sheriff cut her off, taking a single step closer and resting a hand on his belt. "You have authority within your neighborhood. And this," he pointed toward the cabin, then the land around. "U.S. isn't your neighborhood. This is unincorporated county land. The Cedar Pine HOA has zero jurisdiction out here." Tom tried to chime in. "But we voted to extend." "That's not how jurisdiction works," Alex interjected, his voice level. "This land was never under your charter. No annexation was filed. No county approval. No homeowner consent. I've already checked the land title and recorded zoning maps. Your vote means nothing here. What you've done is break and enter. Trespass and attempt a false arrest." Sheriff Nichols nodded and looked toward his deputy. "Get statements, everyone. Then take photos of the damage. We'll need the body cams running. And Mrs. Winthrop," he turned back to her, "you're coming with us for questioning. You're not under arrest yet, but you are being detained pending investigation." Karen's jaw dropped. "This is absurd. I am a community leader. I represent over 100 families. And now you'll be representing them from a police station." The sheriff replied coldly, "Let's go." The deputies began to separate everyone. Karen sputtered indignantly, trying to salvage what little authority she had left. But the damage was done. As she was escorted out onto the porch, I caught a glimpse of her face: rage, confusion, and just the faintest tinge of fear. It was the face of someone who had always wielded power like a weapon, and was now discovering it had no reach here. Tom and Janice tried to backpedal, claiming they were just following her lead and had no idea it would go this far. I made sure to tell the sheriff everything: how they'd shown up days ago with threats, how they'd sent a fake legal notice, how I'd caught them snooping near the fence line. Every detail. Alex provided documentation, photos of the original land deed, printouts of zoning law, even an email from the county registrar confirming that my cabin sat completely outside any HOA boundaries. As deputies moved around us, gathering evidence and taping off the area like a crime scene, I stepped aside with Alex near the broken doorframe. I looked at the splinters of wood, the cracked hinges, the footprints across my once pristine floor. The place that had been my grandfather's legacy, my sanctuary, had been violated by people who believed they were above consequence. The anger inside me wasn't explosive. It was steady, quiet, the kind that comes with purpose. "They think this is over," I muttered. Alex shook his head. "It's just starting. The Civil War begins by Monday morning." The story had already started spreading like wildfire. One of the deputies had leaked dash cam footage to a local news station, and within 24 hours, a segment titled "HOA President Detained After Breaking into Private Cabin" was trending. Neighbors from Cedar Pine Estates were in uproar, some in Karen's defense, most calling for her resignation. Her carefully built image of order and authority was collapsing in real time. But that wasn't enough, not for me. With Alex's help, we filed a civil suit by Wednesday. Multiple counts: trespassing, unlawful entry, destruction of property, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The paperwork was bulletproof. Alex made sure of it. Every clause in the HOA charter, every zoning law, every time-stamped photo was perfectly aligned. We weren't just going to stop her. We were going to bury her in legal truth. It didn't take long before the county got involved, apparently. This wasn't Karen's first time overreaching. In her years as president, she had strong-armed dozens of residents, bullied city council members, and used HOA funds for questionable security upgrades that seemed more like personal vendettas. Once our story broke, others started speaking up: families who had stayed quiet out of fear, neighbors who had paid unjust fines, and even former board members who had resigned after seeing her true colors. The cabin incident had become a flashpoint, and I was no longer the only one fighting back. the cabin. Repaired and reinforced over the next few weeks, I poured everything into restoring the cabin. New reinforced door, upgraded locks, a security system, and cameras installed in every blind spot. What once was a simple escape was now a fortress, not because I feared another attack, but because I wanted to be ready. I had turned my peace into something resilient. Neighbors I had never met started stopping by, offering help. Locals brought firewood, tools, even groceries. A retired carpenter named Luis offered to help me fix the porch at no charge, he said. His daughter had once been fined for leaving a Halloween pumpkin out too long, and had always hated the HOA for it. Now, helping me was his way of getting some peace. Alex stayed for a while longer, coordinating the legal side of things while enjoying the quiet of the woods. We'd sit by the fire at night, sipping bourbon and talking about how power makes people believe they're invincible, until the truth strips them bare. The worst ones, he said one evening, staring into the flames, aren't the ones who scream the loudest. It's the ones who believe their rules are the law. He was right. Karen didn't just think she had power. She thought she was the system. But systems fall, especially when the people finally stand up. The courtroom, the cover-up, and the collapse of Queen Caranthe wheels of justice don't always turn quickly, but when they do, and when they're properly greased with evidence, testimony, and the right representation, they can flatten anything in their path, including a tyrannical HOA president who thought she could impose her will far beyond the walls of her dominion. Within 3 weeks of filing the civil suit, subpoenas were issued. Depositions were scheduled. Karen Winthrop, the almighty self-proclaimed enforcer of community values, now found herself on the other side of the gavel, no longer issuing compliance warnings or levying fines over untrimmed hedges. Now she was under legal fire, and the cracks in her kingdom were growing wider by the day. Inside the Cedar Pine Estates boardroom, panic was unfolding. Whispers turned into meetings, and meetings turned into resignations. Janice Simmons, who had accompanied Karen during the break-in, was the first to jump ship. In a sworn affidavit, she testified that she had been pressured under threat of removal from the board to support Karen's expansionist schemes. Tom Weller followed, turning over private emails that detailed not just the illegal entry into my cabin, but years of questionable board activity, from retroactively applying fines to rerouting association funds for security patrols that were, in reality, Karen's nephew and his friends driving around in rented cars wearing tactical vests. Meanwhile, Alex worked day and night compiling our legal arsenal. Every document was airtight. The footage from my cabin's security cameras, the ones Karen didn't know about, was synced perfectly with sheriff dashcam video and the audio captured from the body cams. The timeline was undeniable. The HOA had not only overstepped, they had bulldozed the boundary between oversight and outright vigilantism. We filed a formal complaint to the County Oversight Board and another with the State Attorney General's office. What had started as a rogue HOA breaking into a cabin was now part of a statewide investigation into the misuse of HOA authority and fraud. But there was more, something deeper, something Karen had been hiding. A whisper from the postone evening, as the sun dipped low behind the pine trees, and I found myself seated on the newly rebuilt deck with Alex. We went over final trial prep when he paused, scrolling through a PDF on his tablet. He looked up, confused. "Did you know Cedar Pine Estates HOA was originally founded under a different name?" he asked. "No." "Why?" I leaned forward. "Well, during background digging, we found the original filing. It was called the Larkspur Property Alliance. Same address, same founding members. But the filing date was almost 8 years earlier than what's listed on Karen's documents." I blinked. "That doesn't make sense. What did she gain by changing the name?" That's what I wanted to know. So I had a paralegal do a full pull on public records tied to Larkspur. Guess what came up? Alex slid the tablet toward me. A scanned headline from an old local paper filled the screen. Larkspur HOA fined $150. Zero for illegal surveillance, intimidation tactics. Below it was a grainy photo, even distorted. The unmistakable platinum blonde bob stood out. Karen. It turned out she had run a different HOA under a different name in a different county, and it had imploded after residents filed lawsuits over privacy violations and coercion. Karen had dissolved the Larkspur HOA under public scrutiny, shifted counties, and rebranded herself as the savior of Cedar Pine Estates. No one in her current HOA knew about her past. She had erased it, buried it like a body, and rebuilt her empire with ironclad rules, a culture of silence, and weaponized bureaucracy. Now, that past was coming back to destroy her. Courtroom. Kaust's civil hearing drew public attention faster than anyone anticipated. What was initially slated to be a quiet small claims affair ballooned into a county-level event, thanks in part to media coverage and the sheer absurdity of the case. By the time the court date arrived, the public gallery was packed. Journalists, other HOA members from around the region, neighbors, even a few of Karen's former board members from Larkspur, now living under new HOA letters and desperate to see justice done. The courtroom was quiet as the judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Marsh, called the case. She'd built a reputation for her no-nonsense demeanor and icy stare, which she now directed squarely at Karen, who sat stiffly in her tailored gray blazer and tried to look composed. But the facade was wearing thin. Alex opened with a bombshell. Not just the footage of the door being broken in or the audio of Karen shouting, "You are under citizen's arrest," like she was leading a revolution, but the real detonator was the Larkspur files. He laid out the timeline, the whole fines, the lawsuits, the sanctions, and finally the quiet dissolution of the Larkspur Alliance when he revealed the Ray registration under the Cedar Pine Estates banner with falsified dates. Even the courtroom gasped. Karen tried to interrupt. "That has nothing to do with this case," but Judge Marsh shut her down. "It has everything to do with intent. Mrs. Winthrop, sit down." Tom and Janice took the stand one after the other, both visibly nervous but clear in their testimonies. They describe how Karen manipulated votes, forged proxies, and used fear of fines or community exile to keep everyone in line. They described her obsession with control not just of the HOA, but of people. She'd once ordered a family to repaint their home 3 times in 3 months. Because she didn't like the shade of tan they chose, she banned Halloween decorations. She fined children for skateboarding on the sidewalk. And now she'd broken into a private home, lied to the police, and nearly got herself shot. When my turn came to testify, I told the truth. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The facts were enough. I explained how I'd inherited the cabin, how I had documented every improvement, followed all county guidelines, and sought peace, not confrontation. And then I described the moment she came through the door, splinters flying, shouting, accusing me of violating rules that never applied to me. I didn't just feel unsafe. I told the court, I felt violated, not just physically but in spirit. Because what Karen did wasn't about safety or community standards. It was about power. And she used that power to try to break people. Silence followed. Even Karen didn't speak. The collapseth ruling came 2 days later. Judge Marsh found in our favor on every count. Karen was ordered to pay full restitution for property damage, emotional distress, and legal costs, totaling over $180,000. More than that, the court declared Cedar Pine Estates HOA's expansion into my property null and void, and referred Karen's falsification of documents to the district attorney for possible criminal charges. But that was just the beginning. The state HOA board launched a formal ethics inquiry into Karen's leadership. 3 other current HOA presidents in nearby communities publicly distanced themselves from her, citing her as an example of power misused. Her own board voted to suspend her indefinitely, and residents in Cedar Pine began filing their own claims against her. Karen didn't resign immediately. Of course not. That would require humility. Instead, she called an emergency HOA meeting live-streamed by several residents where she ranted about media witch hunts and rogue outsiders undermining community order. The video went viral, not for its content but for its comedy. Within a week, she was gone. Not just removed, but disgraced. She vanished from the neighborhood, her house listed quietly with a third-party agent. No goodbye, no apology. Only silence. Peace, earned after the storm cleared. The cabin was finally silent again. Not with the eerie quiet of paranoia or dread, but the true kind, the peace of safety, of knowing that when people stand up against abuse, Even the most entrenched tyrants can fall. Alex eventually returned to his job, leaving behind a trail of legal files, newfound fans, and a bottle of bourbon as a thank you. I stayed in the cabin where I kept rebuilding, not just the property, but myself. Neighbors who once lived in fear now organized community potlucks. One woman, once fined $1,000 by Karen for planting tomatoes, started a neighborhood garden. The HOA was still there but now run by people who listened, people who learned, people who remembered. And as for me, I had never intended to start a movement, but sometimes standing your ground is all it takes to inspire others to do the same, especially when the queen of the HOA breaks down your door and ends up knocking herself off her own throne. The anonymous letter, the hidden agenda, and Karen's final strike weeks following the courtroom victory brought a strange sense of calm to the forest. The cabin no longer felt like a battleground. It breathed again, steady and whole, as if the land itself had been holding its breath through the chaos and now finally exhaled in peace. Birds returned to the porch railing. The deer I once thought had fled the area began grazing in the meadow again, just beyond the fire pit. Inside, the hum of silence returned, not the anxious kind that follows trauma, but the peaceful quiet of justice served. But as anyone who's dealt with power-hungry people knows, they rarely go quietly, especially when the fall from power has been swift and humiliating. Though Karen had vanished from public view, leaving behind a reputation in tatters and a community in repair, the storm wasn't truly over. It had only shifted underground, and the first sign came not from a legal summons or a formal complaint but from a letter, unsigned, slid under my cabin door in the dead of night. I found it early one morning. It was a plain envelope, cream-colored, no stamp, no return address. A sickening déjà vu washed over me the last time I'd received a letter like this. It had been the start of everything. With cautious fingers, I opened it. The letter inside was typed, the font generic and formal, but the tone cold and deliberate. You may have won the court, but not everyone agrees with how you handled this. Some people think you ruined a community. Others know you're not as innocent as you act. Don't get comfortable. Not everyone is finished. No signature, no initials. Just a veiled threat dressed in polite ambiguity. I held the paper for a long time, staring at it as the morning light poured through the windows. At first, I thought it was nothing more than Karen lashing out from a distance, a last act of desperation to unnerve me. But something about the wording felt different, to strategic, to coordinated. Karen was aggressive, theatrical. This was calculated. Alex was the first person I called. He didn't even hesitate. Keep the letter, gloves on when you handle it. I'll have it processed. But listen to me clearly, he said. This isn't over. We might have shut her down in the courtroom, but Karen's obsession with control didn't just vanish when she moved away. People like her plant seeds before they fall, and I think she planted something rotten before she left. The broken roots of cedar pine. What Alex said made more sense than I wanted to admit. Over the next several days, whispers of unusual activity started to filter in from Cedar Pine Estates. The new interim HOA president, a kind but soft-spoken man named Mr. Leland Harris, called me personally. I remember the tremble in his voice, not out of fear, but deep frustration. We're finding things in the records, he said. Things we didn't know existed: off-book transactions, hidden votes. Karen had created an entire secondary HOA ledger. What do you mean? I asked. She was funding shadow operations. There was a separate security budget, one that didn't go through any of our normal approvals. She labeled them community defense line items. But here's the thing, they were going to private contractors. Private contractors. The words sent a chill up my spine. It turned out Karen had funneled thousands of dollars into off-grid surveillance operations, drone purchases, motion cameras installed on properties without permission, and even low-grade tracking devices, allegedly, for monitoring HOA vehicles. But that wasn't the worst part. She had tried to create a private neighborhood militia, not in uniform, not with weapons, but with influence. She had trained a network of residents to file false reports, to manufacture documentation, and to intimidate residents who pushed back. And it seemed clear that, even after her removal, Some of them were still operating. The letter under my door, that was likely the first strike in a campaign to discredit and isolate me. And they weren't limiting themselves to anonymous threats. 2 nights later, I was woken by the sound of gravel shifting. I looked out the window and saw a vehicle idling at the edge of the tree line. Its headlights were off. As I watched, the engine cut. No one got out. It just sat there in silence. After a minute, it slowly backed away and disappeared into the forest road. I called the sheriff the next morning, but by the time they arrived, the tire tracks were already half washed away by rain. It wasn't enough to shake me, but it was enough to warn me someone, somewhere, still believed in Karen's mission, and they were willing to act on her behalf. The journal as if the strange visits and threats weren't enough. The final piece of the puzzle came from a most unexpected place, Karen's own house. After her public fall, her property in Cedar Pine Estates had been left in limbo. Foreclosure notices went unanswered. Mail piled up. Eventually, the house was cleared by a local auction company, and anything of remaining value was sorted and discarded. But someone found something in the attic, a personal journal, leather-bound, tucked inside a crate marked winter decorations. It was turned in by a former HOA secretary who didn't know what else to do with it, and, after skimming the contents, forwarded it to Alex. He called me the same day. She documented everything, he said. Every board meeting, every enemy. She identified every manipulation. She called it the playbook. She even wrote about you before she ever showed up at the cabin. What did she say? She thought you were dangerous, that you were a symbol of unchecked independence. Her words. She wanted to make an example of you. I sat in stunned silence as he read an excerpt over the phone. It was chilling. The cabin will be the test case. If we can bring that property under the HOA, the rest will follow. Resistance must be crushed early and publicly. If it means legal gray areas, so be it. I am the law until someone proves otherwise. Alex paused. She didn't just act impulsively. She had a plan, and she had others helping her. We knew what had to be done. The final move, using the journal as a foundation. Alex and I submitted new evidence to the county attorney, with support from several residents. And now the Cedar Pine board itself. We began dismantling what remained of Karen's shadow empire. The journal included names, dates, and even communication logs that led us to a private online group, a forum where Karen and her most loyal followers had shared strategies, targeted individuals, and plotted expansion efforts into surrounding rural properties. It was sick, it was strategic, and it was bigger than anyone had realized. But once it was exposed, once we brought the full scale of her agenda to light, it crumbled fast. The remaining holdouts distanced themselves quickly. Those who had once felt empowered by Karen's rhetoric now looked like scared followers of a failed cult leader. Civil citations followed. Restraining orders were issued. And within 2 months, the Cedar Pine Estates HOA publicly apologized to every homeowner it had wrongfully fined or harassed under Karen's regime. Karen herself, she never resurfaced. Her social media went dark. Her accounts were closed. Last anyone heard, she was living in a small town under her maiden name. But by then, it didn't matter. Her empire was gone, not just broken but dismantled piece by piece, root to crown. The cabin reclaimed. When I look at the cabin now, I don't see a battlefield. I see victory earned through endurance. I see a reminder that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and that no structure built on fear, manipulation, or lies can stand forever. This place was once threatened by a woman who mistook power for purpose. Now it stood stronger than ever, not just as a home, but as a symbol. And though it all started with a broken door, it ended with something far greater, the end of a reign, the rebuilding of a community, and the beginning of something real. New blood, old shadows, and the rise of a real community. Months passed, and with each season's change, the scars left behind by Karen's destructive reign began to fade. Though the memory of what we'd endured never quite disappeared, the cabin, that once stood as a solitary bastion of resistance, was now something more, a lighthouse for those who had felt powerless for too long. Strangers who had followed the court case or watched the video footage online occasionally made their way to the outskirts of the forest, not out of curiosity, but to express something deeper, solidarity. One man, a retired schoolteacher from 2 towns over, brought me a hand-carved walking stick with the words "Stand Your Ground" etched into the handle. Another woman, a mother of 3 who had once lived under Karen's original Larkspur, HOA, dropped off a handwritten letter thanking me for taking a swing at the monster we couldn't. But beyond the cabin, change was underway in Cedar Pine Estates, to change that was both welcome and, at times, messy. The post-Karen landscape was like a forest after a wildfire, cleared of the immediate danger, but riddled with debris, confusion, and the hard work of regrowth. Leland Harris, the interim president, had done an admirable job holding the community together in the fallout. Quiet and thoughtful, he approached his leadership with humility rather than command. But he was never meant to be a permanent leader, and the community knew it. So when the first open board elections in years were announced, Cedar Pine found itself in unfamiliar territory: freedom, not the fake version Karen had peddled, where order was mistaken for peace, but real democratic freedom. And as with all freedom, it came with uncertainty. Candidates emerged, each promising transparency, collaboration, and reform. Some were genuine, others less so. One name in particular stood out: Gavin Moore. On paper, Gavin seemed ideal: young, energetic, charismatic. He was a small business owner who'd moved into Cedar Pine 2 years prior. In community forums and open town halls, he spoke eloquently about balance between oversight and independence, rules and respect. He said the right things, wore the right smile. But something about him didn't sit right with me. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Carefully, like every word was designed, every smile calibrated. I'd seen that kind of charm before. So had Alex. Do a background sweep, I said one afternoon as we walked the perimeter of the cabin, our boots crunching along the frost-tipped trail. There's something about him that doesn't feel organic, like he's rehearsing for a bigger stage. Alex didn't need convincing. He promised to look into Gavin's business, his ties, his social history, and especially his affiliations with Karen, if any existed. What we found didn't shock us, but it did sicken us. Gavin Moore was no outsider. He was Karen's protege. Not directly, there was no obvious photograph of the 2 shaking hands in front of the HOA sign, but deep in the financial records of Karen's shadow HOA accounts, Gavin's name appeared as a recipient of consultation funds, over $8,000 paid to him in the months leading up to her legal collapse. He had been listed under a false LLC name, Moore Home Services, but the bank records and address matched. Gavin had been paid to advise on community stability, a sanitized way of saying he had helped lay the groundwork for Karen's control systems, and now he was positioning himself to rebuild what she had lost, but this time smarter, more subtle, cloaked in charm. The return to the Araneth moment. We had the documentation. We knew we couldn't sit on it. I didn't want to wade back into the HOAS world. I had one, and I was content to let the cabin speak for itself, but silence in the face of a second takeover would have made me complicit. So I wrote an open letter, not a smear piece, not an attack, a statement of truth. I laid out Gavin's financial ties, the timeline, the contradiction between his campaign speeches and his past affiliations. I ended it with a single line: it is not enough to remove a tyrant if we allow them to plant seeds that grow into something worse. The letter was published on Cedar Pine's online community forum. Within hours, it was shared, dissected, debated. Some defended Gavin, calling the payments a coincidence. Others accused me of paranoia. But most listened, because they remembered what Karen had done, and they weren't going to be fooled again. Gavin responded the next evening in a video post: slick lighting, warm tone, rehearsed sincerity. He didn't deny the payments. He called them part of a consulting project I did before I understood the full extent of Karen's agenda. He apologized beautifully, but it wasn't enough. Trust, once lost, is rarely earned back with a well-lit apology. He withdrew his candidacy 3 days later. The real leaders stepped forward. What happened next was something I never expected. Dozens of residents, most of whom had never been involved in the HOAS politics, began stepping up, not just to run for board seats, but to support new initiatives. A group of mothers launched a community childcare swap, Retired veterans offered to mediate disputes. Before they escalated to formal complaints, a young couple proposed an open, backyard weekend where residents could walk through each other's gardens and socialize like neighbors, not rivals. Slowly, the HOA stopped feeling like a governing body and started to feel like a community again. Leland officially stepped down after the elections, passing the baton to a newly elected board made up entirely of first-time members, every one of them committed to transparency. The first rule they passed was to eliminate the compliance committee entirely. The second, to repeal every Karen-era fine that had been issued without proper documentation. I was invited to the first open community forum after the elections. I almost didn't go. I wasn't sure I belonged. But when I walked in, the applause caught me off guard. Not because I needed recognition, but because it wasn't just for me. It was for a new chapter, one they were writing together. Beyond the cabin with cedar pine restored and Karen's influence dismantled, I finally felt what I hadn't felt in a long time: closure. The cabin, once surrounded by conflict, now stood as a monument to resilience. I replaced the door, not just the physical one, but the symbolic one, the one Karen had shattered when she barged into my life. The new door was crafted by hand by Louise, the retired carpenter who had helped me after the trial. It bore no engraving, no sign, no plaque, just strong, clean wood, reinforced and solid. Alex and I still talk often, sometimes about law, sometimes about bourbon, sometimes just about life. He told me recently that the case was now being cited in legal seminars about HOA overreach and the balance between community management and civil liberty. That made me smile. I never set out to be an example. I just didn't want to be a victim. But maybe that's what resistance is. Not about making noise, but about standing your ground when everything around you says to sit down. And maybe the greatest justice isn't seeing your enemy fall, it's seeing what rises after they're gone. The legacy we built from the ruinements after Gavin Moore stepped away. From his thinly veiled attempt to resurrect the authoritarian roots Karen had planted, Cedar Pine stood taller, stronger, and perhaps for the first time unified. The fresh snowfall layered the roofs like a clean sheet over a worn past, but no one was trying to forget. We didn't erase what had happened, we honored it by learning. My cabin, now rebuilt and surrounded by a gently worn dirt path from so many visitors, had become less of a monument and more of a meeting ground. Strangers came to speak, neighbors came to connect, schools asked if they could bring high school civic students out for field lessons. The irony of that wasn't lost on me. What was once an outlaw's hideout, judged and condemned by a rogue HOA president, had become a beacon for civic engagement. Still, despite the peace, there were days when silence sat heavily on my shoulders. I'd walk out to the edge of the lake, where frost clung to the reeds and the water was still as glass, and I'd remember the sound of splintering wood, Karen's battering ram against my cabin door. No apology ever came from her, no letter, no restitution. She'd vanished, her name now a whisper that people avoided speaking aloud, like a curse they didn't want to summon back. And though the justice system had made her answer for her crimes, her damage lingered in mistrust, in trauma, in scars. But that winter, something unexpected happened that shifted everything again. It began with a knock on my cabin door. Ironic, I know, and standing on the porch was a woman in her mid-50s, bundled in a navy wool coat, her gloved hands trembling slightly. She introduced herself as Marianne Walker, Karen's sister. The air between us grew colder than the snow-laced wind. My first instinct was to shut the door, but there was something different about Marianne's softness. Where Karen had barked, remorse. Where Karen had seethed. She asked for just 5 minutes. I didn't know the extent. She began, her voice low. Karen told us the community was falling apart, that she had to enforce rules because people were becoming reckless. She made it sound like she was saving the neighborhood. I said nothing. I let the weight of her words sit with her. Then she took out a folder and placed it on my table. Inside were letters Karen had written, but never sent, drafts of apologies, some scrawled in pen, others typed but never printed. One in particular had my name on it. It wasn't enough to erase what she'd done, but it cracked the armor I'd worn for nearly 2 years. Karen, even at her worst, hadn't been born a tyrant. Something had made her that way, lost control. Perhaps a bitterness that metastasized. Marianne spoke for nearly an hour. She didn't defend her sister. She grieved her. Karen had moved away alone, now under a court order not to engage in HOA activities again in any county in the state. That was her sentence, permanent disempowerment. Before Marianne left, she handed me a photograph. It was from decades ago, Karen as a child, smiling on a summer lake dock with their father. This was before she turned bitter, Marianne said. I don't ask for forgiveness, just understanding. She left quietly, and I sat for a long time, holding that photo, wondering how many Karens were out there, not yet in power, not yet in control, but sitting on the edge of bitterness, one grievance away from becoming monsters. That's when I realized it wasn't just about stopping Karen. It was about making sure communities never created another one. Seeds of a new culture inspired by that moment and by Alex's continued belief that education could change everything. We launched a new project, the Cabin Initiative. It was a non-profit organization focused on educating communities about their rights under HOA agreements, how to spot abuse of power, and how to build democratic, neighbor-led structures instead of centralized control. The first initiative was Modest, a downloadable toolkit for any homeowner looking to challenge unjust HOA rules. But within weeks, it gained traction. Lawyers volunteered. Former board members who had left in protest contributed anonymously. We offered workshops, webinars, a hotline. Within 6 months, our online community had over 15,000 members nationwide. People from Arizona to Maine shared their HOA horror stories, but more importantly, how they overcame them. One story stood out. A young couple in Nevada had been fined $500 for letting their disabled daughter paint a mural on their backyard fence, something that technically violated HOA aesthetic rules. After using our resources, they rallied 20 other residents, overthrew the board, and changed the guidelines to include community artistic expression zones. That mural now spans half a block. That was when I realized that what we had built out here in the woods, born from injustice and resistance, wasn't just a personal victory. It was a spark, and people were lighting their own fires across the country. The visitor who changed everything. In day in spring, a black SUV pulled up the gravel road leading to the cabin. I assumed it was Alex. He often visited for long weekends, but out stepped a tall, well-dressed man with a clipboard, followed by a film crew. He introduced himself as Thomas Whitlock, a producer with a major documentary network. He had been following the Cabin Initiative's growth and was interested in creating a series about modern American resistance, featuring stories of people who'd stood up against systemic abuse, starting with HOA letters, but branching out into school boards, workplace hierarchies, even city councils. Our story, he said, was the most compelling of all. I wasn't interested in fame. That had never been the goal. But the idea of helping others understand that resistance wasn't rebellion, that it was survival, that it was accountability, struck a chord. We agreed to participate. Filming began that summer. They captured interviews with neighbors, board members, the judge who ruled against Karen, and even a former HOA president from a different state who had turned whistleblower. The series was called Common Ground, Reclaiming Power in America's Neighborhoods. When it aired, it went viral within days. But the real moment that took me by surprise was when a young man, barely 20, showed up at the cabin. Months later, his name was Derek. He had watched the series after his own HOA tried to fine his grandmother for planting a fruit tree in her front yard. I didn't know people could fight back, he told me. I thought we just had to take it. He spent the weekend helping clear brush, fix up the fire pit, and organize old case files. Before he left, he said, "This place makes you feel like you're not alone." And that, I realized, was the legacy. Not the legal win, not the viral clips, but the idea that people, no matter how isolated they feel, aren't powerless. Final reflections. Years after the day Karen tried to storm this cabin and break me with threats and intimidation, I sit by the fire with a quiet peace I never expected to feel again. The wind no longer howls with memory, it hums with stories. Stories of change, of growth, of stubborn, beautiful resistance. Alex still visits, though he's busier now. giving lectures across the country about constitutional protections in private communities. He never tires of telling our story, and I never tire of hearing others. Like it, the cabin door the one Karen shattered is now mounted on a display wall inside the cabin. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Above it is a simple inscription: when power knocks without invitation, remember you have the right not to answer. And outside, just beyond the trees, you can hear the voices of a new community planting, laughing, building, not a utopia, but something far more valuable, a home where no one rules alone, and no one stands alone, because in the end, it wasn't about the HOA. It was about what kind of people we choose to be when power forgets its purpose. And we chose to be unshakable,